On July 28, 1942, Joseph Stalin issued Order Number 227, forever known as Not One Step Back. But buried within this infamous directive was a lesser-known provision that would seal the fate of hundreds of thousands of Soviet soldiers. This order formalized the creation of Strafni Battalioni, or penal battalions, where Soviet military personnel convicted of cowardice, retreating without orders, or even minor disciplinary infractions would be sent to redeem their crimes with blood. What followed was one of the most brutal military experiments in human history. These weren't ordinary combat units. They were deliberate death sentences disguised as second chances. Between 1942 and 1945, over 420,000 men passed through these units. The statistics are horrifying. 52% monthly casualty rates, 24% killed, 58% wounded. If you were sent to a penal battalion, you had only a 3% chance of surviving your term and being pardoned. This is the story the Soviet Union buried in classified archives for decades. If this shocks you, imagine what else history has hidden. Like this video, subscribe for more untold stories, and comment below which WW2 topic we should expose next. Let's uncover the truth together.
Lieutenant Ivan Sokolov stood among 300 other men in a frozen field outside Stalingrad on November 15, 1942. 2 weeks earlier, he had been a respected platoon commander in the 62nd Army. His crime? Ordering a tactical withdrawal when his position became untenable, saving 18 of his 22 men from encirclement. Under Stalin's Order 227, that withdrawal, even though it saved lives and preserved fighting strength, was classified as cowardice. The tribunal took 8 minutes. He was sentenced to a penal battalion, a Strafbat, where he would earn redemption through blood or die trying. Sokolov and the other men assembled that morning represented a cross-section of Soviet military society. Some were genuine deserters or those caught fleeing battle, but many were officers who had made tactical decisions later deemed unauthorized, soldiers who had criticized commanding officers, men who had been captured by Germans and escaped back to Soviet lines only to be suspected of collaboration, and even soldiers guilty of nothing more than being in the wrong place when their commanders needed scapegoats for military failures. The penal battalion system operated on a simple, brutal premise. Crimes against military discipline could be absolved through exceptional courage in combat. But the Soviet definition of exceptional courage meant volunteering for missions where death was virtually certain. These weren't regular combat assignments. Penal battalions were systematically deployed to the most dangerous sectors of every major operation, sent to clear minefields by walking through them, ordered to conduct frontal assaults against fortified positions without artillery support, and used as expendable forces to probe German defenses and reveal enemy positions through the simple expedient of being killed in large numbers. The monthly casualty rate of 52% wasn't an accident or the unfortunate result of difficult fighting. It was the designed outcome of a system that viewed these men as resources to be consumed rather than soldiers to be preserved. Soviet military planners understood exactly what they were doing. Declassified documents from the Soviet archives reveal that penal units were specifically assigned missions with casualty projections of 60 to 80%. Regular units were given objectives with expected casualty rates of 10 to 20% for the same operations. The penal battalions were literally being sent to die. The organization of penal battalions revealed the Soviet regime's calculated brutality. Each Strafbat contained between 500 and 800 convicted soldiers, commanded by regular Red Army officers and NCOs who volunteered for the assignment in exchange for accelerated promotion and increased pay. These commanders were not convicted of crimes themselves. They were overseers, jailers with military ranks whose primary job was ensuring the penal soldiers completed their suicide missions rather than deserting or refusing orders. Behind each penal battalion stood blocking detachments, NKVD troops whose sole purpose was to prevent retreat. Any penal soldier who turned back from an attack would be shot immediately by the blocking detachment. There was no option for tactical withdrawal, no possibility of falling back to regroup. Every attack was one-directional, toward the enemy or death. The Germans quickly learned to recognize penal battalion assaults. The attacks followed predictable patterns: minimal artillery preparation to avoid wasting ammunition on disposable troops, mass frontal assaults without tactical sophistication, soldiers armed with basic weapons and minimal ammunition, and waves of men advancing directly into concentrated machine gun and artillery fire with no covering fire or support. German after-action reports from Stalingrad, Kursk, and the later battles of 1944 specifically mention these recognizable suicide attacks. One German machine gunner stationed at Stalingrad described shooting continuously at advancing Soviet troops who kept coming despite suffering catastrophic casualties, noting that the attacking soldiers appeared to have no choice but to advance, even when tactically it made no sense. He was witnessing a penal battalion attack. The men advancing toward his position weren't driven by tactical objectives. They were driven by the certainty that turning back meant immediate execution. What made the system particularly cruel was the retention structure. A penal soldier could earn release from the battalion through exceptional bravery, being wounded in combat, capturing enemy positions single-handedly, destroying enemy equipment, or completing a specified term of frontline service. In theory, this offered hope. In practice, it was an impossible standard. To be wounded meant surviving long enough in combat to receive a wound that was serious enough to qualify for medical evacuation, but not immediately fatal. Given the 52% monthly casualty rate and the nature of penal battalion missions, most wounds were fatal. Soldiers hit by artillery fragments, machine gun fire, or mortar explosions in the open ground of frontal assaults died before medical personnel could reach them. The penal battalions received the lowest priority for medical evacuation. Regular troops were evacuated first, then support personnel, then, if resources remained, penal soldiers. Medical personnel testified after the war that they were explicitly ordered to prioritize treatment based on the soldier's status. A seriously wounded regular soldier received immediate evacuation. A similarly wounded penal soldier might wait hours for treatment, during which time survivable wounds became fatal from blood loss or shock. The mine-clearing operations assigned to penal battalions represented the system's purest expression of calculated human expenditure. The Soviet advance across Eastern Europe from 1943 to 1945 required crossing territory the retreating Germans had systematically mined. Millions of anti-personnel and anti-tank mines lay buried in fields, roads, forests, and urban areas. Standard military doctrine called for engineer units equipped with metal detectors, mine probes, and protective equipment to slowly and methodically clear these obstacles. But this took time, and time delayed the Soviet advance. The solution was horrifyingly simple. Penal battalions would clear mines by walking through suspected minefields in extended lines until the mines detonated. The explosions would reveal the minefield's location and boundaries. Survivors, if any, would mark the cleared paths. Engineers following behind would then safely clear remaining mines the penal battalion had missed. This wasn't occasional emergency usage, it was systematic policy. Declassified Soviet documents specifically allocate penal units to mine-clearing operations across multiple fronts throughout 1943, 1944, and 1945. The casualty rates for these operations exceeded even the horrific 52% monthly average. Some mine-clearing missions saw 80 to 90% casualties within hours. The men ordered to walk into minefields knew exactly what they were doing. They weren't ignorant soldiers following orders they didn't understand. They were fully aware they were being used as human mine detectors, that each step might be their last, and that survival was almost entirely a matter of random chance. Some refused. The NKVD blocking detachments shot them. Others obeyed, walking slowly into the fields until the explosions began. Survivors describe the psychological horror of hearing explosions to the left and right, seeing comrades torn apart by blasts, knowing the next step might trigger a mine directly beneath your feet, and having no choice but to continue walking forward because stopping or retreating meant immediate execution. Anti-personnel mines typically contained enough explosive to sever a leg or inflict fatal abdominal wounds, but not enough to kill instantly. Wounded men lay in minefields for hours, screaming for help that could not reach them because the field was not yet cleared. Medical personnel could not approach without triggering more mines. The wounded either bled to death, died from shock, or, in some cases, were shot by officers as acts of mercy to end their suffering. German forces defending against Soviet advances quickly adapted to the Penal battalion mine-clearing tactic. They began placing machine gun positions overlooking known or suspected minefields. When Soviet penal units began their walking advance to clear mines, German gunners would open fire, killing soldiers who survived the mines or forcing them to run, which triggered more mines. The tactic was devastatingly effective. Entire penal battalions were annihilated, clearing single, large minefields. Their bodies left scattered across the field until engineers could safely recover them days or weeks later.
The Battle of Kursk in July 1943 represented the largest deployment of penal battalions in a single operation. The Soviet defensive preparations included multiple fortified lines, extensive minefields, anti-tank ditches, and artillery positions designed to channel German armor into killing zones. When the German offensive began on July 5, Soviet commanders immediately deployed penal battalions to the most threatened sectors. Their orders were simple: hold positions until relieved or annihilated, launch counterattacks against German penetrations regardless of odds, and delay German advances by any means necessary, including suicidal resistance. The 8th Penal Battalion was assigned to defend a 2-kilometer sector of the 1st defensive line north of Kursk. The battalion numbered 650 men when it took position on July 4. German forces struck this sector on July 6th with tanks and mechanized infantry supported by artillery and airstrikes. The Penal Battalion had no anti-tank weapons except Molotov cocktails and magnetic mines that required soldiers to approach tanks closely enough to attach the explosives by hand. Both methods required extraordinary courage or suicidal desperation. The attack lasted 6 hours. German forces overran the position by early afternoon. Of the 650 men in the 8th Penal Battalion, 487 were killed, 144 were wounded and captured by German forces, and 19 escaped to Soviet lines. Not one man from the battalion was pardoned for exceptional bravery during the action because the battalion failed to hold its assigned position. The survivors were transferred to another penal unit to continue serving their sentences. This pattern repeated across the Kursk battlefield. Penal battalions absorbed the initial German attacks, suffering catastrophic casualties while buying time for regular Soviet forces to organize counterattacks. The tactical value was undeniable. German forces exhausted themselves breaking through positions defended by troops the Soviet command considered expendable. But the human cost was staggering. Conservative estimates suggest that penal units at Kursk suffered 68% casualties over the 2-week battle, compared to 23% for regular Soviet forces engaged in the same operation. The casualty differential wasn't coincidental, it was planned. Soviet operational orders specifically assigned penal units to sectors where German attacks were expected to be strongest, while regular units were positioned in sectors where attacks were less likely, or assigned to counterattack roles after penal units had absorbed the initial German assault. The system treated human lives as tactical resources, measured by their utility in accomplishing military objectives. Penal soldiers were less valuable than regular soldiers, therefore they were spent more freely. The logic was perfect within a totalitarian framework that measured value by political reliability rather than human worth. What made the system uniquely cruel was that many penal soldiers had been sent to these units for crimes that in any other military would have resulted in minor punishment. Retreating without orders might earn a reprimand or demotion in Western armies. In the Soviet system, it earned a death sentence deferred only long enough to extract maximum tactical utility from the condemned man.
By 1944, as the Soviet advance accelerated westward into German-occupied territory and eventually into Germany itself, the penal battalion system reached its peak utilization. Over 170,000 personnel passed through penal units in 1944 alone, suffering total losses of 170,298 killed, wounded, and missing, essentially a 100% casualty rate when accounting for the constant flow of new convicted soldiers replacing losses. The final statistics tell the complete story of the system's brutality. Between 1942 and 1945, approximately 422,700 convicted Soviet military personnel were sent to penal battalions. Of these, 24% were killed, 58% were wounded, 14% were pardoned for exceptional bravery, 3% served their complete terms and were released, and 1% were listed as missing or deserters. These numbers reveal the mathematical horror of the system. If you were sent to a penal battalion, you had a 24% chance of being killed, better than even odds of being wounded, and only a 17% chance of leaving the unit alive through pardon or completing your term. The 1% desertion rate is particularly telling. Despite facing near-certain death in combat, fewer than 1 in 100 penal soldiers attempted to escape, because the NKVD blocking detachments and the knowledge that desertion would result in their families being arrested made escape even less survivable than frontal assault against German positions. The Soviet government suppressed information about penal battalions throughout the war and for decades afterward. Soviet propaganda emphasized heroic sacrifice and patriotic resistance against fascism. The existence of military units where Soviet soldiers were used as expendable tactical resources contradicted the official narrative. The archives remained classified until the 1990s, when Russian historians finally gained access to the operational documents, casualty reports, and NKVD records that revealed the full extent of the penal battalion system. Survivors of the system rarely spoke about their experiences. The social stigma of having been convicted of military crimes persisted long after the war ended. Many men who survived penal battalions found themselves unable to obtain good employment, denied military honors awarded to regular veterans, and socially ostracized by communities that viewed conviction, even for minor offenses, as permanent stains on character. The few memoirs that do exist, published decades after the war, describe a universal experience: the constant presence of death, the absolute certainty that survival was a matter of luck rather than skill, the psychological burden of watching comrades die in wasteful attacks, and the bitter knowledge that their own government valued their lives less than those of regular soldiers. These were men who volunteered or were conscripted to defend their country, who then made mistakes or ran afoul of a brutal disciplinary system, and who were subsequently treated as disposable resources rather than human beings. Their story remains one of the most tragic and least-known chapters of the Eastern Front, a reminder that wars kill not only through enemy action, but through the calculated decisions of leaders who value victory more than the lives of their own soldiers. The penal battalions achieved their tactical objectives. They delayed German advances, absorbed casualties that would otherwise have fallen on regular units, cleared minefields, and conducted suicidal attacks that occasionally succeeded through sheer persistence. But the human cost was unconscionable, a deliberate policy of treating convicted soldiers as expendable resources whose lives had value only in how they could be spent to achieve military objectives. This is the hidden cost of total war, and it's a story that deserves to be remembered.